Welcome back to main title animation. This is frame 2, scene 2. This frame was created as the inspiration for the rest of the style frames. So again, the pressure was on for frame 1, scene 1 animation, but for this frame, we've really got to push the animation as well to sell the title sequence. But I think it'll go fairly quickly. This is more of a straightforward scene to animate. The imagery is already very powerful, and it just comes across as a scene that'll be fairly easy to animate. So let's dive in and animate scene 2. So immediately I'm beginning to revise and tweak the light leak. This is a plugin from Luca Visual Effects called Light Leak. I use it quite a bit. And you can see that the ink that was already in the After Effects timeline from the design phase already works. So here I'm finding a point in the music, and this is a point that something needs to happen in the animation. I'm hitting the period on the keyboard to preview the sound. Back in the composition, I'm dragging the ink effect further down in the timeline where the sound hits. Because I'm thinking that it might be cool to reveal the soldier at that point. And possibly before we see the soldier, we could see this American flag possibly slowly blowing in the wind. So making all the layers 3D and adding a new 35mm camera. And doing a slight move side to side in the scene. You could just as easily animate all the layers. You could parent the layers to a null and animate the null side to side, but typically I find that creating 3D layers and then just animating a camera gives me more control over the scene. I didn't like the placement of the type, and that type was placed there in the design. But oftentimes when animation starts, it's revealed that certain elements may not work they originally were in the design. In this case, the type has to be moved because it's going to be revealed over the soldier's face, and the flag will probably be gone at that point. The soldier's face is such a light colored image that it's hard to see the type. Here I'm adding a black solid shadow that I'm adding a mask to and then feathering that mask. I'll turn down the opacity of that shadow layer quite a bit as well. And it just creates a real soft shadow underneath the type. I'm also parenting the shadow to the texture that's in the type. So if I ever move the type, the shadow will follow. What I'm doing here is bringing the type forward in Z space and then scaling it down So in essence, the type looks like it's the same scale and the same position, but it's actually forward in Z space. So on the camera move, there's going to be some parallax that happens. So the background image will move at a slightly different rate than the foreground text. And again, this gives more dimension and depth to the animation. It's a very subtle effect, but it works. Here I'm pre-composing the 3 text layers. It's the text, the texture that is used in the text, and the background shadow. And I'm pre-composing them, and then I'm dragging the ink footage just above that text, and I'm going to create a Luma or alpha matte to reveal the text. I've actually done the opposite here. I've transitioned the text off the screen with the ink. So I think it'd be interesting to reveal the text in some sort of animation, some subtle animation. So what I've done is I've pre-composed the texture, and in the pre-comp I have added a card wipe. I increased the rows and the columns substantially. Set the flip order. And then set the transition completeness. So it's interesting when you set the timing randomness to 1, the effect just took on a completely different look. As you can see here, it's just like a kind of almost like a blocky reveal. It's not quite digital. It's kind of like a digital grungy reveal, but for this it works. And then back in the texture pre-comp, I've added a fractal noise, and what I'll do here is I'll turn the transfer mode to a screen, and I will animate the evolution with a simple expression time times 200. And as you can see here, now the fractal noise is moving on top of the texture. In the final comp, it'll be a very subtle effect, but subtleties help to sell animation. Also, by adding the rough and edges effect, it makes the edges of the blocks less perfect. It almost has a camo look to the shapes now, instead of a blocky mosaic feel. Yeah, that's looking cool. I think the rough and edges could be just a little too much, so I turn that effect down. Now onto the flag. What I'm doing here is trying to use a distort effect, the wave warp effect, to make the flag look like it's just slowly waving in the wind. If I wanted to be super precise with this effect, I'd probably cut out the flag from the background and just apply the effect to the flag. But it's going to be such a subtle effect in the end that it's not completely necessary on this particular scene to cut the flag out. So the wave warp isn't completely working for me, so back in distort, I'm adding a ripple effect. I'm setting the center of the ripple to the left of the flag. Turning the wave width quite high. And there, it's starting to look like it's a waving flag in the wind. So like I said, it's such a subtle effect that we can see the flag waving in the wind, but we don't necessarily notice the background rippling as well. I'm thinking it might be interesting to see an American flag laid over the face of the soldier. So I bring in an image I have of a flag. I'm scaling it down, setting to overlay, scaling and positioning. It's kind of interesting to see the star over his eye. And then I'm just going to mask out the flag. An easy way to mask without having the flag distract us is to turn the flag layer into a adjustment layer so it's invisible. And then we can go in and just mask like so. And then turn off the adjustment layer and voila. I think this needs to be feathered slightly. Yeah, that's looking cool. So now the American flag needs to also transition in with the ink. So I'll duplicate that layer. Set it above the flag and set the flag to Luma Matte. The ink. I think it could be interesting to offset the two ink footage layers slightly. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm dragging the keyframes from the time remapping and just extending them out and offsetting them. Renaming my layers so I can be a little more organized. As I mentioned in the previous video, a lot of times I organize the project at the end. I don't really recommend that. If you're organized to begin with, you can move a lot quicker. So here I'm just listening for the audio hit, because I think something needs to happen here. And I think that something is the ink hit. I'm fine-tuning the transition completion. I don't want the transition to start at 0 or 100%. I want it to start somewhere in the middle. So this is starting to get close. So here's a piece of stock footage I have that I purchased from VideoHive for another project. And I thought it'd be interesting to try in this project. I've applied the time warp effect, and you can see the difference by switching to whole frames here, what it does. The time warp effect is a really interesting effect that I haven't fully mastered, but the little I have done to play around with it, it's a pretty cool little effect. So I thought adding this distressed cardboard texture over the flag might be interesting. And then what I've done here is I'm looking for a good point to loop. Once I find a good looping point, I just duplicate the layer and drag it out. Yeah, you can see that just adding that simple texture really brought an extra layer of dimensionality again into the animation. Here I just switched the order of the effects to see if I can notice the fractal noise anymore. It's so subtle that it's really hard to pick it up. So here I turned off the shadow. It felt like it wasn't really helping much. And I'm checking the fractal noise to see if I can see it better. So the scene's feeling pretty good. I thought it might be interesting to add a transition at the end of this scene to move into the next scene. So I have these warm shutter stock footage pieces that I got free off the internet. If you search for warm shutters free, you'll probably find quite a few. The warm shutters are a little too warm, so I add a hue and saturation and drop the saturation by about 50%. I'm also using a transition from universe during this. It's a film transition. And that's how you see the little film pops that happen. Okay, back in the comp, I try adding a second texture. It doesn't work quite right for me, so I've tried adding a paint texture. And I want to see if I can use the paint texture to reveal another texture. And as the last part to this scene, I felt like the beginning with the flag was just a little too boring for the time that it was up there. So I've brought in another image I had for my source materials. And I added it to the scene. I've set it to hard light. And it might be interesting just to see this image over the flag and then have it fade out. Just a little more to look at. Here I'm adding a null object, setting it to 3D, and then parenting the camera to the null. What this is going to do is I'm going to create a cut in the scene so that the camera pops in closer at the sound hit. So by setting two hold keyframes, the first hold keyframe is a little bit further out in Z, the camera's a little bit wider, and the second hold keyframe is where the camera originally was at. And by popping between these two hold keyframes, we create the illusion of a camera that cuts in. Cool, this is looking good. I think it's time to move on to the third scene.